There are chapters of American history that many people never learn in school. Not because they are small, but because they disturb the clean story a nation prefers to tell about itself, and they still shape what feels normal today. This story is not meant to shame anyone, it is meant to complete the picture that textbooks often simplify, without turning history into a tribal fight. When a country remembers only victories, it loses the warnings hidden inside its failures, because the next crisis arrives before the next lesson. The United States has inspired the world with ideals of liberty and self-government. Yet it has also struggled, again and again, to apply those ideals equally in courts, neighborhoods, and the ballot box. In this video, we will move through hidden chapters from early colonies to the modern era, connecting them like one long thread of power, fear, and consequence. And we will focus on patterns rather than outrage. Every society creates a simple narrative because simple narratives are easier to celebrate, easier to teach, and easier to market, because comfort often fights curiosity. The darkest chapters usually begin with a quiet belief that some lives matter less, and that belief spreads faster when it is rewarded. And once that belief becomes policy, it spreads quietly. The result is not only personal cruelty, it is a system that rewards compliance, punishes resistance, and calls itself tradition, while giving itself a moral story that sounds like common sense. Systems can survive for centuries even when slogans change, because the incentives underneath them remain stable, and institutions learn to wait out outrage. To understand the modern United States, we have to understand how those systems were built, funded, defended, and rebranded in money, media, and law, not only in speeches. We start with slavery, because it shaped early wealth, political power, and the social hierarchy in almost every region, from plantations and ports to elections and lawmaking. Slavery was not only violence on plantations, it was also paperwork, contracts, shipping, advertising, and finance. Enslaved people were bought, sold, insured, and used as collateral, turning human life into a number on a ledger, and that arithmetic trained society to ignore suffering. Ports, mills, and merchants profited from goods produced by forced labor, linking distant cities to suffering they rarely witnessed. Laws protected owners, while courts treated enslaved families as property, making separation and sale a legal routine, and families could be separated with a signature. Religion and pseudoscience were often used to justify the system, giving cruelty a mask of legitimacy and moral certainty, so profit could be preached as destiny. Even people who never owned slaves could benefit from cheaper goods and expanding markets, which is how systems recruit bystanders. When slavery ended, wealth built over generations did not vanish. It stayed concentrated where it already was, shaping who could inherit and who could recover. Reconstruction promised a new beginning, yet that promise was attacked by violence, intimidation, and political compromise, and the promise of equality met backlash and fatigue. Freed families searched for safety, land, and education, while local authorities often tried to restore the old order, while communities built schools under constant threat. Sharecropping trapped countless people in debt, keeping labor cheap while looking legal on paper through unfair contracts and debt that never ended. Black codes and later Jim Crow laws restricted movement, work, voting, and public life, turning freedom into a narrow hallway, from schools and courts to buses and ballot boxes. Terror was used as a tool of policy, because fear can enforce rules faster than any court and cheaper than any reform, and it teaches people to whisper when they should speak. Over time, segregation became normal to those who benefited from it, and invisible to those trained not to look, until injustice feels like weather instead of a choice. The civil rights movement proved change is possible, but it also revealed how hard institutions fight to stay the same, and it took extraordinary courage to demand ordinary rights. Many modern inequalities make more sense when we remember how long inequality was written into law and enforced by routine, shaping education, housing, and health outcomes for decades. Slavery and segregation were not the only chapters built on removal, because the land itself was taken through pressure and force, and ownership was framed as destiny. Native nations lived on these lands long before the United States existed, with complex societies, diplomacy, and trade networks. As settlers expanded, Treaties were signed with promises that sounded permanent until they became inconvenient. Land hunger turned negotiations into ultimatums, and ultimatums into violence, relocation, and broken communities. And legal language often hid coercion. Forced removals pushed families onto routes where hunger, disease, and death followed, leaving trauma that maps rarely show, leaving grief that maps never show. Even when people survived the journey, they often arrived to land that could not support them, making survival itself the punishment. Military posts, railroads, and new towns rose where older communities had been erased, as if absence proved ownership. Boarding schools targeted children, cutting hair, banning languages, and punishing tradition to reshape identity, turning childhood into a battlefield for identity. This was described as civilization, but it functioned as cultural destruction because identity was treated as the enemy. Generations later, many native communities still fight for treaty rights, land access, and the basic dignity of being heard, and many fights today trace back to old promises. When history calls this progress, it hides the cost paid by those pushed aside, and it teaches the wrong lesson because belonging was defined by politics and panic. Another uncomfortable chapter is how immigration and belonging were defined not by ideals, but by politics and fear. And the gate of opportunity was opened and closed like a weapon. For long periods, laws favored some newcomers while excluding others, turning the idea of opportunity into a gate with a lock. Policies like exclusion and quotas reflected anxieties about race, labor, and culture, shaping who could legally build a life, deciding who could legally build a life. The story of America as a nation of immigrants is true, but it is also incomplete without the story of who was pushed away. Fear is another engine of dark history, because fear makes citizens accept what they would normally reject, because fear makes extreme policies feel reasonable. During World War II, Japanese Americans were treated as suspects based on ancestry rather than evidence, and suspicion was treated as proof by people who demanded certainty. Families were removed from homes, businesses were lost, and entire communities were forced behind fences, under armed guard, under fences, guard towers, and confident headlines. The policy was presented as protection, yet it punished loyal citizens without trials or due process, while officials described it as temporary and necessary. Years later, official apologies admitted the injustice, but lost time and lost property could not be fully restored, and repair is always slower than damage. The lesson is simple. When fear becomes policy, rights become fragile, and fragility invites repetition. Medicine is supposed to heal, yet history shows institutions sometimes harm in the name of research, prestige, or control, and bias can hide behind credentials. In the Tuskegee study, treatment was withheld from black men even after effective cures existed. The harm was not an accident. It was a decision sustained for years by professionals who understood the consequences. Proving harm can be institutional without looking like hatred. This betrayal damaged trust in healthcare, and mistrust can echo for generations long after the paperwork is archived, because mistrust can be inherited like a family story. When people say science is neutral, they forget people run science, and people carry bias, incentives, and blind spots. Dark history also lives in factories, mines, and fields, where profit can outweigh safety when workers have little power, especially when workers are replaceable and safety is expensive. In the industrial era, brutal conditions were common, and deaths were treated as the cost of doing business. Child labor placed children in dangerous jobs because families were desperate and employers wanted cheap hands. Labor strikes were sometimes met with violence, as private guards and state forces protected property over people. When regulations finally arrived, they often came after tragedy. Proving reform can follow suffering rather than foresight, before protections existed and warnings were ignored. Some groups were excluded from fair wages and protections for decades, deepening inequality across regions and industries. Housing became another battlefield, because where you live decides schools, jobs, safety, and the wealth you can pass down, because where you live shapes schools, jobs, and wealth. Redlining and discriminatory lending shaped neighborhoods for generations, creating lines that looked financial but acted social, creating lines that looked financial but acted racial. When a system denies opportunity quietly, it can later blame individuals loudly. Which is how responsibility gets inverted, because blame is cheaper than repair. Government power can also target dissent, especially when dissent threatens reputations, profits, or political careers, especially when dissent threatens profit or elections. During the Red Scare, suspicion ruined lives, divided communities, and turned disagreement into a risk, and accusation became a shortcut to control. Surveillance expanded because fear of enemies made extraordinary measures feel normal, and normal is hard to roll back, because emergency tools rarely disappear afterward. Later, programs monitored and disrupted activists and movements, treating demands for justice as threats to order. And surveillance can become a habit rather than a response. When the state labels critics as dangerous, the public can forget that criticism is a democratic tool, not sabotage, confusing criticism with danger. Secrets grow in the dark, and secrecy makes accountability difficult, especially when consequences are delayed, because secrecy protects reputations. Power reached beyond borders as well, where Cold War strategies reshaped other nations with lasting consequences, and foreign lives became pieces on a board. The United States supported coups and strongmen in the name of stability, even when democracy was weakened and violence was empowered. These actions were defended as necessary, yet they often produced long-term violence, resentment, and instability, and the aftershocks lasted for decades. Ordinary people abroad paid the price for decisions made far away, with little ability to influence them, because remote decisions create local nightmares. War created more dark chapters, because wars expand authority while shrinking scrutiny and compressing debate. And the cost is paid long after headlines move on. In Vietnam, official narratives often clashed with reality, and public trust fractured as contradictions became visible, while official stories competed with lived reality. Many soldiers returned with trauma, while many civilians abroad carried scars that never made headlines. The pattern repeats. When institutions control information, truth becomes contested terrain, and cynicism grows, turning truth into contested terrain. Domestic policy created long shadows too, especially in policing, punishment, and the politics of fear. Especially when fear is used to sell simple solutions. The war on drugs was framed as safety, yet enforcement often fell hardest on poor communities and communities of color, and enforcement often landed heaviest on the poor. Sentences grew longer, prisons expanded, and entire neighborhoods felt constant pressure from the state. As punishment expanded, while opportunity shrank. Mass incarceration did not appear overnight. It grew from laws, incentives, and political choices that were sold as common sense, because policies can look neutral while acting selective. When punishment becomes a business, reform becomes harder, because profit resists change, and silence becomes convenient, because profit resists reform. None of these chapters mean American ideals are worthless. They mean ideals require constant defense and honest measurement, and they require constant defense through law and culture. Honest history is not hatred, it is responsibility, because denial is how patterns return when conditions repeat. Because denial is how patterns return. People can love a country and still demand truth from it, because love without honesty becomes performance. Because love without honesty becomes a performance rather than a commitment. Refusing to look at the past is one of the fastest ways to weaken a nation from within, because it blocks learning, because a society that cannot learn must repeat. The goal is not to replace pride with shame. The goal is to replace myth with understanding and understanding with wisdom, so understanding can become wisdom instead of propaganda. Understanding allows empathy, and empathy supports better policy, better institutions, and better choices in hard moments. And empathy supports better choices in hard moments. If we can see how fear and profit created harm before, we can recognize those signals when they appear again. We can ask who benefits, who pays the cost, and who is being told to stay silent. We can remember that rights are not gifts, but protections that must be defended through law, culture, and daily practice. We can understand that the darkest history is not only what happened, but what people were trained to accept as normal. And when normal is built on exclusion or progress is built on silence. It must be questioned, Because the past cannot be undone, but the future can be shaped by what we choose to learn and what we refuse to normalize. So if you want honest history that connects the dots, stay with this channel, keep watching each week, and subscribe to History Refuge.